I never believed a laugh could heal, until hers silenced everything I was running from. The first time I heard her laugh, it wasn't even directed at me, but somehow, it stopped everything else. I was sitting by the window of that small seaside café, sketchbook open, pretending to work while really just trying to breathe. The world outside was noisy, the chatter of tourists, the hiss of the espresso machine, the scraping of chairs. But her laugh, it cut through all of it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was light, real, the kind that comes from someone who's forgotten for a second that anyone else is watching. I looked up. She was behind the counter, pouring coffee for a couple of locals, her hair tied loosely, strands catching the sunlight that slipped through the glass. There was something calm about her presence, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that quietly earns it. Her laughter faded into a gentle smile, and when her eyes briefly met mine across the room, I froze. She didn't look away immediately either. Just a small, polite acknowledgement, like we'd both heard something neither of us could explain. For weeks, I'd been trying to adjust to this new town, convincing myself that solitude was freedom. I'd left behind a city full of noise, work stress, half-hearted relationships, expectations that drained the soul. But here in this little café, for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt alive. And somehow, her laugh had something to do with it. I came back the next morning, telling myself I liked the coffee. Truth was, I barely remembered the taste. What I remembered was the way she moved, steady, purposeful, the rhythm of someone who'd learned to make peace with quiet. I noticed how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she concentrated, or how her eyes softened when she spoke to the regulars. She carried a warmth that didn't ask for attention but somehow filled the room. When she noticed me again, she smiled. "Back so soon?" she asked. Her voice was low, kind, touched with humor, maybe curiosity. I nodded, fumbling for words, and said something about the view. She laughed again, that same unguarded sound that had brought me here in the first place. And in that moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not like in the movies. Just a quiet recognition that I wanted to hear that sound again, not because it was beautiful, but because it made everything else fade. When I left the cafe that morning, the sea breeze was sharp, carrying the faint scent of salt and roasted coffee. The world felt a little slower, a little clearer. I remember thinking, maybe peace isn't a place. Maybe it's a person. I didn't know her name yet. But her laugh had already carved its way into the rhythm of my days. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't running from silence. I was running toward it.by the third morning. The cafe had already become part of my routine, though I kept pretending it wasn't about her. I told myself I liked the coffee, the quiet view of the ocean, the way sunlight painted soft gold patterns on the wooden floor. But every time I opened that glass door, my eyes searched for her before anything else. She was always there behind the counter, sleeves rolled neatly, hair pinned back in that effortless way that made her look both composed and unguarded. She moved with a kind of practiced ease, the way someone does when they've done something 1,000 times and still care about every small detail. When she poured coffee, she looked at it like she was measuring peace. The cafe wasn't busy that morning. Just 2 old men playing cards by the window and a mother helping her little girl read a menu. I took my usual seat near the corner, sketchbook open but untouched. When she noticed me, she smiled, not the polite kind reserved for customers, but the familiar kind people give when they recognize you've returned by choice. "Back again," she said, approaching with a towel draped over one arm. Her tone was light, teasing. "You might as well start paying rent for that table." I laughed, caught off guard by her playfulness. "If the rent's in coffee, I think I can manage." That earned another smile, softer this time, a faint dimple appearing near her left cheek. She poured my usual without asking, the motion smooth, her fingers steady. The scent of roasted beans mingled with the faint perfume she wore, something subtle, like jasmine and rain. She leaned slightly on the counter, looking at my sketchbook. "You draw?" "Try to," I said. "Mostly when I don't know what else to do with myself." Her expression shifted, curiosity laced with something gentler. Then you must be doing a lot of trying lately. I smiled at that, caught between wanting to deflect and wanting to stay in this small truth she'd uncovered. She didn't press further, she just nodded, as if she understood more than I'd said. There was something disarming about her quietness, how she could make a simple exchange feel like a conversation that mattered. When she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed, just for a second. But it was enough. A tiny current of warmth, unexpected and grounding. She didn't pull away too quickly, and neither did I. The rest of the morning passed in easy silence. She moved between tables, and I pretended to draw, though I found myself sketching the curve of her hand instead of the sea. As I left, she called out, "See you tomorrow?" I turned, smiling. "If you're making the coffee." Her laugh followed me out the door, low, real, unguarded, and for a moment the wind from the ocean seemed to pause, like even it wanted to release. The first rain of the season came quietly, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just appears, soft and steady, turning the streets into mirrors. Most of the café's customers had already left by the time I walked in, shaking water from my jacket. The place was dimmer than usual, its warm glow diffused by the gray light outside. She looked up from wiping a table and smiled, a little surprised. "Caught in it?" she asked, nodding toward the rain. "Didn't think it'd come this early," I said, brushing a few drops from my sketchbook. She gestured toward the corner. "You might as well stay until it stops. It's not a day for rushing anywhere." Something about the way she said it made me sit down without hesitation. There was comfort in her voice, a steadiness that felt like shelter. She brought me coffee without asking, setting it down with a faint clink of porcelain on wood. The air smelled of rain and roasted beans, rich and grounding. Minutes passed quietly. The rain grew heavier, drumming softly on the windows. I could hear the faint hum of an old record playing in the background, a jazz tune that sounded like memory. She leaned against the counter, watching the water slide down the glass. "I used to love this kind of weather," she said, her tone thoughtful, "until it started reminding me of endings." I looked up. There was no sadness in her voice, not really, just honesty. The kind that invites silence, not pity. She sat across from me, untying her apron. "I'm sorry, that's not exactly café talk." "It's the best kind," I said softly. "The real kind." That made her smile, small, fragile, but real. For the first time, she looked less like the composed woman behind the counter and more like someone letting herself breathe. She told me about her life before this town, the marriage that had ended quietly, the way she'd built this café from nothing afterward. Not out of ambition, but because she needed a place to belong again. I listened, barely speaking, afraid to interrupt the rhythm of her words. Every sentence felt like a piece of her she hadn't shared in years. When she turned the question on me, why I'd come here, I hesitated. Then told her the truth, that I'd left a job that no longer felt like mine, that I'd been running from the version of myself I didn't recognize anymore. She didn't judge. She just nodded, eyes softening, as though she understood that kind of quiet escape all too well. "You don't have to run forever," she said gently. "Sometimes stillness is what saves you." For a moment, the world outside disappeared. Just the two of us, a half-finished cup of coffee, the rain whispering against the glass. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door and handed me an umbrella. Her fingers lingered on mine as she adjusted my collar. "Don't let the rain chase you off," she said with a faint smile. As I stepped into the soft gray light, I realized she wasn't talking about the weather. The next few days felt quieter, and not in the peaceful way they used to. Something in the air between us had shifted after that night in the rain. It wasn't uncomfortable, just heavier. Like we were both aware of something we hadn't named yet. When I walked into the café the following morning, she greeted me with her usual smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a flicker of hesitation, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. She poured my coffee the same way, asked about my sketches, even laughed when I joked about my inability to draw hands properly. But beneath it all was a silence that neither of us wanted to disturb. Maybe she felt it first, the whispers that come so easily in a small town. I noticed it too. The way two older customers at the corner table leaned in when I walked by, or how her assistant, a girl barely 20, looked at us with quiet curiosity. It wasn't cruel, just the kind of talk that turns truth into something it's not. I tried to ignore it, but she couldn't. She'd lived here for years. Her reputation was part of her armor. I could see the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, the way her laugh came less often, the way she kept a measured distance now. One afternoon, I stayed until closing, pretending to work on a sketch. She was wiping down tables when she finally said it, softly, like she was afraid the words might hurt if spoken too loudly. "I think people are starting to notice." I looked up. "Notice what?" She hesitated. "You. Me. The way we talk. The way you look at me." There it was, the truth hanging in the air between us, fragile as glass. I wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that people could think what they wanted. But I knew that wasn't true. For her, it did matter. She had built a life here, a reputation rooted in quiet respect. I was just passing through, untethered, unafraid of whispers. But she couldn't afford to be that free. "I don't want to make things harder for you," I said finally. Her gaze softened, regret flickering there. "You're not. I just..." She trailed off, searching for words. "I just can't have something beautiful become a rumor." The silence that followed wasn't angry or cold, it was full of everything we couldn't say. I wanted to reach for her, to close that small, aching space between us. But she turned away before I could. For the next week, I still came to the café, but things were different. She greeted me like a customer, not like someone she once lingered beside in the rain. Our conversations became shorter, polite. She smiled when she needed to, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. Yet every time our eyes met, something flickered there, a warmth that refused to die out completely. It was a quiet defiance, a shared ache that neither of us wanted but both of us held on to. And in that silence, between what was allowed and what was felt, the distance between us began to speak louder than words ever could. The nights had grown colder, and so had the air between us. I still came to the café, though I told myself each time it would be the last. But habits made from comfort are harder to break than ones built from necessity. And she had become both. That evening, the streets were empty, the sea restless beneath a bruised sky. I saw her through the window before I entered, wiping the counter, lost in thought, the lights casting a soft amber glow around her. The sign on the door said closed, but I knocked anyway. She looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "We're closed," she said, voice tired but kind. "I know," I replied, stepping inside. "I just needed to say something." She hesitated, watching me the way someone watches a wave approach, unsure whether to stand still or step back. "All right," she said quietly. "Say it." I didn't have the right words, just the kind that came from the heart before the mind could interfere. "I'm sorry," I began. "If I've made things harder for you. If people are talking, or if it's..." She stopped me with a small shake of her head. "You don't have to apologize for being kind." Her voice was steady, but her eyes told another story, exhaustion, fear, and something gentler buried beneath. I stepped closer, close enough to see the faint tremble in her hands. "I just hate that I've made you pull away," I said softly. "Because the truth is, you make everything quiet. I don't know why or how, but when you laugh, when you look at me, it feels like the noise stops. I didn't mean for that to become something people could twist." For a long moment, she said nothing. The rain began again outside, soft, rhythmic, like punctuation to everything left unsaid. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You make it sound simple." "Maybe it is," I said. "Maybe it's only complicated if we let it be." Her breath caught, a faint tremor betraying her calm. She looked down at the cup she'd been drying, setting it aside carefully, as if it might shatter. Then she met my eyes again, and for the first time, She didn't hide the emotion there, the want, the hesitation, the ache. "You don't know me that kind of love," she said softly, though the word love felt fragile, untested. I stepped closer, my voice low. "Maybe I don't know it. Maybe I just feel it." Our hands found each other then, almost by accident, almost by fate. Her fingers were cool, trembling slightly in mine. I didn't squeeze, didn't pull her closer. I just held on, long enough for both of us to feel that it was real. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence didn't need words. The cafe felt different now, sacred somehow, as if time had slowed to make room for what we weren't ready to name. When I finally left, she didn't stop me. But as I stepped into the rain, I caught her reflection in the glass, still watching, still there. And for the first time, I understood, not every apology is for something you've done. Sometimes it's for everything you've both been afraid to feel. The text came just before dawn, short, simple. "Meet me by the beach?" No explanation, no time. Just that. Her name glowing on my screen was enough to erase any hesitation. The streets were still half asleep when I walked toward the shore, the air damp with salt and morning mist. The horizon was a soft blur of silver and pale blue when I saw her. She stood barefoot in the sand, coat wrapped loosely around her, hair tousled by the wind. The ocean behind her looked endless, but for once, it didn't feel intimidating. It just felt honest. She turned as I approached, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You came. I would have come even if you hadn't asked," I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. She laughed softly, not the bright, unguarded sound that first drew me in, but something gentler, fragile. "I wasn't sure you'd still want to see me after the other night. I wasn't sure you'd still want to see me," I admitted. She looked away then, toward the horizon, where the first trace of sunlight touched the waves. "I didn't sleep much," she said. "Kept thinking about everything, the whispers, the age difference, how unfair it all feels. And then I thought, maybe the only unfair thing would be pretending it doesn't mean anything." The words hung between us, raw and unpolished. I stepped closer, close enough to see the morning light catch in her eyes. "It means something," I said quietly. "Even if we never say it out loud." She nodded, her breath visible in the cool air. "That's what scares me." I hesitated before reaching out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. My fingers grazed her skin, a fleeting, reverent touch. She didn't move away. Instead, she closed her eyes, as if memorizing the feeling. For a long while, we just stood there, two silhouettes against the waking world. The sea moved in slow, rhythmic waves, each one pulling the tide closer to our feet. The wind wrapped around us, carrying the faint scent of salt and warmth. "I've spent years being careful," she whispered. "Afraid of being seen the wrong way, of giving too much. But with you, I just stop thinking. And that terrifies me." "Then let it," I said softly. "Let it terrify you. Let it mean something." She looked at me then, really looked, and something in her expression softened. She reached for my hand, her touch deliberate this time. Our fingers intertwined easily, as though they had been waiting for this moment all along. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The closeness said everything, her head resting briefly against my shoulder, my thumb tracing slow, calming circles over her hand. The stillness between us wasn't awkward, it was full. Complete. The sun climbed higher, painting her in gold. She turned to me, eyes glistening. "One day at a time?" I smiled. "One day at a time." And as the waves washed over our feet, the world felt quiet again, not because it was silent, but because, for once, we were. Months passed, though sometimes it felt like only days. The world didn't change much. The same waves, the same streets, the same café tucked at the corner of the boardwalk. But somehow, everything felt different. Maybe it was because we were different. Not in a sudden, dramatic way, but in the quiet kind that only those who live it could ever notice. I still came to the café every morning. Only now, I didn't take my usual corner table. I stood beside her behind the counter, learning how to grind beans, pour espresso, steam milk just right. She said I made a mess of the foam most days, and I did, but she always smiled when she said it, that same soft smile that had undone me months ago. There were no more whispers, or maybe we just stopped listening. The world kept turning, people kept talking, and we kept showing up anyway, side by side, choosing this small, ordinary kind of happiness. Sometimes love doesn't need grand gestures. Sometimes it just needs consistency. Her laughter filled the room more often again. It was the same sound that had first caught me, light, real, unguarded, but now I understood it better. It wasn't just joy, it was healing. It was what it sounded like when someone decided they didn't have to hide anymore. On slow afternoons, when the sunlight spilled across the tables and the sea breeze slipped through the half-open door, she'd rest her hand lightly on my arm as she passed. Small, grounding gestures. Unspoken affirmations. And every time, I'd look up from what I was doing, and she'd already be smiling, like she knew I still hadn't gotten used to how good it felt to be seen that way. We didn't talk about the future much. Maybe we didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between us, that what we had didn't need labels or promises to make it real. It was in the way we moved around each other, in the space we made for silence, in the peace that came from simply being. One evening, long after closing, we sat outside the café steps, watching the last light fade from the horizon. The town had gone still, the only sound the distant rush of waves. She leaned her head on my shoulder, sighing contentedly. "Funny," she said softly. "For so long, I thought peace was something you found alone. And now?" I asked. She smiled, eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of the sea. "Now I think it's something you build, one quiet moment at a time." I turned toward her, brushing my thumb along the back of her hand. "You make the world feel quiet," I murmured. She looked at me then, her expression warm, steady. "Maybe that's because, with you, it finally is." For a while, we just sat there, wrapped in that stillness. No grand confessions, no dramatic declarations, just two people who had found their rhythm in the calm after everything else. And as her laughter broke softly through the night air, I realized it hadn't just made the world feel quiet anymore, it had made it whole.